This is a game that could be easily said to be iconic. Released in 2012 on the PS3, developed by that game company and a score by Austin Wintory, Journey is an action-adventure game with a pared-down gameplay yet unquestionable power, which holds a very special place in the opulent world of video games through the experience it gives to the player regardless of the conditions in which it is played. Indeed, Journey can be played alone or in co-op, a co-op whose characteristics largely contribute to the success of this game and its rather unique status, as it illustrates one of the game's themes, communication, as well as that strange combination of strength and fragility, of distance and fusion that are human relationships, especially friendship. Journey is a reflection on transmission by its will to tell several stories, by the construction of its music, a transmission that gives way to life, to the need to live things like a mountain to climb, a transmission that goes beyond the mere moment of the game and stretches long after. It is a work whose very solemn, almost codified character reinforces by contrast moments of intense communion with nature and the creatures of the game's world. It is a game in which language, omnipresent, is a source of knowledge and energy, but disappears at a time when it would seem most necessary in order to show another way to communicate through the rhythm of a joyful chirp, that of the character, and Austin Wintory's meticulous work on articulation. It is the journey of a masked character dressed in a red robe decorated with embroidery. Alone in the desert, they sink into the sand before being granted flight thanks to a scarf filled with symbols. As long as there are symbols on the scarf, one can fly. The desert is explored, we find other symbols which lengthen our scarf, tapestries telling the story of these silhouettes dressed in white that we meet when praying near statues. We progress in the desert because only one thing counts, the mountain. We will get there by any means, whether we have to tread the pink sand, slide through sunken city, hide from mechanical guardians, climb to the top of a fog-filled tower, face the storm and our fate. There are several stories in Journey. First, there's the story we are told, the story of the world it seems, and of the ancestors, the white robes, who tell it to us without a word, through the mind coupled with a form of prayer or at least meditation. At the end of each level, we sit in front of a small monument in their image, which allows us to access another plane where an ancestor seems to be waiting for us, and then chimes in, revealing this story through images, tapestries, or glyphs. These images tell their story, which is distinctive by its mythological aspect, almost like a cosmogony, a story of creation of the world, but it would seem they also tell our story. For there is of course another story, the one that the playable character lives. This time, after the creation shown by the images from the tapestries, it's the exploration of the world. A simple exploration, simplistic, as the levels seem to be only an excuse. Indeed, the goal of these levels is limited. This is not about learning the history of the world, actually. The ancestors do take care of that. Almost all the tapestries that can be found in the world are seen at some point during those history lessons. There is no difficulty, there are few puzzles, and this isn't a matter of reward or satisfaction in the game design. For example, in the tower level, all that matters is to fill the whole cavity with fog by finding tapestries in order to get to the top. That's very little. Yet it is, like all the other levels, a very beautiful moment. It's no surprise. In this game, it's the journey that counts. Well, that one was easy. And despite the fact that they do have a desire, it almost seems as if this small character dressed in red is only there to listen to the story they are told. The goal, stated, shown from the very first moments of the gameplay, is quite distant. The top of the mountain, the bridge that haunts us and seems to haunt the ancestors too. However, this does not tell us much more, because if we actually reach the top of the mountain, if we actually walk through that bridge, there is nothing to discover. except for this metamorphosis in star, in symbol rather, like this symbol that obviously created us. It would seem that our character exists only for the duration of the game, as there is no before nor after. We appear in a very sudden way, a spontaneous creation of the mountain, and we return there to finish our journey and our life. The playable character has no past nor future. We don't miss anything of their life because their life is limited to the span of the game, making it more intense and even more connected to the player. The story of the playable character would be as long as the story of the player. But the player lives a story of their own, reinforced by the large meta-dimension of the game. If the first playthrough is already fascinating, journey after journey, one can renew the experience by testing the boundaries of the game, for example, the physical limits. The OOB is quite substantial. There is a world beyond the world that you can explore alone or in co-op. Trips are organized, even events like the Scarveless Saturday or Ruby Tuesday. People meet, explore together, getting around the supposedly restrictive conditions due to the co-op. Indeed, you cannot choose your travel companion. This one is determined from the second level, the bridge, depending on the progress of other players on the server. You will be associated with someone who is at the same place in the adventure, but their name will be revealed only at the very end of the game, during the end credits, a sequence that allows us to embrace the world at another scale. The world is immense, as we seem so tiny, but as a star we can now embrace it in its entirety. This choice, that of the co-op, underlies another dimension of the game: transmission. The story of Journey's world, that of the ancestors, is told from individual to individual, from these white-robed figures to us, a small red-robed character. We are taught their story and could, in turn, teach it to someone else. These are also things that are passed on from co-op to co-op, elements of the game itself, the tapestries, the location of the glowing symbols, or habits such as drawing a heart in the snow at the end of the game. Those who have already played the game have information that they will be able to pass on tacitly to their companion, protecting them from the activation of the first guardians, as well as their devastating ray, for instance. This knowledge we obtain is indicated by an embroidery on our dress. After each accomplished journey, a row of patterns is added on our tunic as a materialization of the experience, of the wisdom acquired once again. This transmission is coupled with knowledge, since our dress changes when we obtain all the symbols. As a form of highest knowledge, it becomes white. It should be noted that during a first game in co-op, we will never be coupled with the player wearing a white robe. This white robe makes it easier for us to move around. We start with a longer scarf, so we can fly for a longer time, and it is recharged just by walking on the sand. The pieces of cloth that usually recharge our scarf are then much less useful. However, it doesn't give us any special status in the game, at least in the diegesis. The white-robed ancestors won't have a different attitude towards us, and the end will be the same. For a fellow traveler, on the other hand, we will embody a form of knowledge. So it seems that we do not have the same status as the ancestors despite the color of our dress. They themselves do not have embroidery on theirs, so we would still have a different place in the Journey universe than they do. There is difference between them and us. We learn. Perhaps this transmission goes both ways. If we learn the history of the white robes, they learn, albeit a little late, how to apprehend the world in which they lived, how to consider the creatures they hunted. We seem to have an easier time communicating with the creatures than with these impressive characters. For them, it seems to be the opposite. The idea of transmission is present through the very structure of the music. The soundtrack begins with a piece that is never played in the game, Nascence. Its function is to let us hear the leitmotif. Journey's music is based almost exclusively on this theme, and stating it clearly at the very beginning is a way of explicitly drawing our attention to it. It is pure transmission. Here's the theme, pay attention to it, listen to it, memorize it. It is a transmission that turns into a game when we have fun finding it in each piece. The transmission takes place on another level, that of the construction of the pieces. In essence, the solo cello states the theme, which is taken up by the bass flute supported by the harp, which elegantly guides the discourse, also announcing that in Journey, it is a matter of stories to be told, to be listened to, and to be lived. In the third iteration, the two solo instruments will blend, joined by the orchestra. Here, the leitmotif, although undoubtedly associated with the mysterious playable character, is in fact the theme of transmission. It does not illustrate a place, a function, or even a hero, it is inherently the theme of transmission. The beginning sounds like a speech, a request for attention from the solo cello, a first deep, wise voice suddenly rising. Then the story begins, but with another voice, as if it was someone else's turn to talk. Each one will then bring their contribution, their counterpoint. This transmission is a learning process. Each instrument will learn the theme and appropriate it, notably through articulation, a very important element in Austin Wintory's music, or at least in the scores of Abzu and Journey, to which I will return later in this video and which will reflect another duality in Journey, the question of individuality. This learning is sometimes even a little more. There is in the attitude of the ancestors a notion of warning. These characters seem to have a form of omniscience. They have access to the past, their own or their ancestors, to the present, our own history, our birth and our adventure, as well as to the future, our failure at the foot of the mountain. At the last moment, before crossing the last of these huge doors which stand between us and the mountain, the ancestor unrolls the entirety of our journey from past to future. Alone in front of this immense tapestry, our fate is sealed, we will fail. Are you sure? They seem to ask us through their soft yet inquiring look. There is a choice to make, but is there an actual choice here? The history of the ancestors can be interpreted in itself as a warning. Nothing is said about the mistakes of these white-robed characters. Their past is indeed sadly common. They entered into conflict because of this form of energy that seems to be the cloth, the fabric itself, and the creatures made from it. What had brought them together turned them against each other. The choice of such a representation is interesting because it is very binary. They are either side by side or back to back. And they created guardians out of cloth creatures to crisscross the world in search of the smallest piece of this living matter. Perhaps, however, these machines were peaceful before, used as a means of transportation. It was, however, already a form of enslavement. Telling the story is then a way of warning against the ancestors' mistakes, which is nevertheless paradoxical, as our story seems to have no actual connection with theirs. But this final choice, as we discover our destiny, is an illustration of the idea that the journey defeats everything else. After having learned everything, as we now also have the knowledge of this world, of its birth and its decline, of our adventure and our destiny, we choose to go through. The warning gives way to life. Ironic when we know we are going to die, but that is precisely the idea, living the experience. And in the music too, we find this idea through the beauty of the phrasing of the instrumentalists. To really grasp everything about this music, at some point you have to play it. At least you have to live it, enjoy every change of tone, every portamento, every detail of sound and phrasing again and again, and marvel at it. This injunction, this urge rather to live, is expressed in the game through sequences, too, where any level design seems to completely disappear in favor of moments of absolute communion with the world in the company of the cloth creatures. In the first, the character slides down an infinite slope filled with raw sienna sand in the ruins of a sunken city. In the second, which corresponds to the very last section of the game, the character flies, finally, to the top of the mountain. This necessity of transmission, this learning process, implies a form of discovery. Indeed, this journey seems to be that of a character who discovers a world they are nevertheless intrinsically a part of. The game begins with a literal call. A musical one and another more mysterious call, that of this familiar character, who will yet remain from journey to journey as enigmatic as ever. The camera lingers on the key elements of the world, of this part of the world rather, the sand, the blinding sun, and the first objective, this small sand dune, or these small stones, tombstones. A reflection appears. It is a star leaving a trail of symbols in its wake. The point of view changes. It is now that of the star. We fly over the desert before suddenly the playable character appears on the screen, as if they had just materialized, born from this star. Born from the music too. The solo cello calls out to us. The use of the solo instrument in a register that is already high for the cello is more gripping. It announces the theme of individuality. Indeed, at the beginning, there is only that, there is only us. It states the theme of the work, while a strong effect of sound accumulation supports the opening of the theme and the appearance of the elements from the desert on the screen. The solo instrument is lost in a storm of strings that will be taken up again at the end of the adventure in the piece Nadir, and finally everything stops. As if they were born from the chaos of the music and the impact of the star on the ground without us witnessing it, this elegant figure with a masked face and a red dress imposes themselves on the screen, their importance underlined by the descending movement of the camera stopping on the low-angle shots. Although masked, they're intriguing. Alone for now, they are not, however, unique. The game maintains a paradoxical relationship to individuality, but I will come back to this later, as I always do. From the moment the character appears on the screen to the moment they disappear from it, merging with the dazzling white of the mountain bridge, there is no ellipsis. Of course, I will develop this point in the next part, the game is very codified and you access each level by passing through a grill door. At that moment, there is a fade to white towards the beginning of the next level. If there is an ellipsis, it is extremely short, at most a few moments after leaving for the sunken city. Nothing about the character is told through any cutscene. They do have access to their entire life just before the mountain itself, but we witness their whole existence, the entire cycle. The world and characters of Journey are relatively uncharacterized, in that they are perhaps simple but not simplistic, and can be interpreted metaphorically, notably the omnipresence of sand. The architecture makes some references, notably to Arabic architecture, with the large doors we get through after each history lesson. Then at the end there seems to be Japanese gates story. In any case, they look very similar, which can be quite relevant regarding the interpretation of this moment. But apart from that, since there are few other constructions but mostly sand, the game doesn't try to evoke a particular place to relate to a specific culture. It is far from being unique, of course. It's the same thing for the characters. They are masked, they are wearing a robe, so their visible features are very limited. We only see their eyes and their silhouette is completely erased by the dress. Everyone can see themselves in this ageless, mysterious and elegant figure. Rather than faithfully recreating a specific place to situate us strongly in space and time, the game will rather extract us from it in order to insist on these characters belonging to the world they discover and explore. Journey apparently takes place on two planes. The main plane, the one in which we evolve most of the time, this wide desert, and the plane where we receive the history lessons, the plane of the ancestors. Are we physically present there? It's not really clear, but it seems that we access it through mind, prayer, or meditation. Our character undoubtedly belongs to this first plane, the world of the desert and the mountain. Indeed, contrary to the ancestors, the color of our dress matches the universe we evolve in. The color palette in most of the levels is built around red, sienna, or ochre tones, except for the desert, which is pink and green, or the tunnels, blue-green like the Guardians. Globally, the colors seems to show that we are an element of this world, contrary to the white robes, which however lived in these places where we are now. Yet there is white, since there is the mountain. The ancestors would not be so alien to this world after all. The two colors could refer to the different attitudes that the playable character and the ancestors had towards the creatures from the desert. They used them, we are interested in them. Also, we don't destroy anything. We never do. We interact with the world, we change a few things, but ultimately very little. The tapestries appear, the tower fills up with fog, but mostly we release the cloth creatures. We bring this world back to life. Finally, the chirp accentuates the unity between our character and the universe in which they evolve. The sounds follow the harmony of the piece. This is an element sometimes used in video games, a sound design in a different key or just a different concert pitch. From the background music will convey discomfort, as in many more ways. The horns do not blend with the music. We understand that something is wrong. Unlike the sound design of the prayer in Tunic, which is very immersive, following the harmony of the music. Here, the diegetic element, the chirp, which is part of the universe of the game, and the music, a priori non-diegetic, it's an accompaniment, it is not playing in the world itself, are united. This results in a very strong feeling of belonging to the world and brings this music into the desert itself. It seems to come from the world. Apart from a few moments, it is rather unstructured. One rather finds the idea of sound layers appearing and disappearing. The idea of communion between the character and this desert they, however, seem to hardly start discovering, begins fairly quickly, especially as the chirp is reinforced by instruments from the soundtrack. Cello, flute, even sometimes a kind of voice, especially when the chirp is charged. One last thing, the character is dressed in cloth dress and moves by walking or flying thanks to the energy of a cloth scarf, the same cloth from which the creatures of Journey are made. At first, small simple rectangles of fabric that can, however, evoke schools of fish, their humanity becomes obvious in the desert. They react to our presence, our contacts, turn around us, fly with us, but also have fun by themselves, hiding in the sand. Later on, they look like plants, algae, jellyfish, and even whales. Their sound design is very rich, moving, sometimes amusing. When the whales appear, there is a small comical sound effect. We hear some kind of cooing, essentially sound elements that convey their happiness. Sometimes it even seems that they're laughing. The character too is very nicely humanized. Yet their very appearance seems solemn. Their face is masked, making immersion easier, like the garment conferring a lot of elegance to the silhouettes, much more than the first concepts, more concrete or even aggressive. This tunic hides their arms. These have no importance in the gameplay except sometimes to fly. We briefly flap our arms, underlining the poetic aspect almost of the movement. We generally seem to slide on the sand and the jump is automatic. We seem to float very slightly over the obstacles while crossing them. When walking becomes more difficult, it's because we're approaching the limits of the map. We are sliding. The movement combines two aspects, one related to earth, the contact, sometimes difficult, with the sand, and the absolute freedom of the flight, and sometimes the line between the two disappears thanks to the animation. When the character falls from a certain height, they land with an elegant roll and shake their head. It's a very nice detail that humanizes them. It's very strange, they're quite solemn through their postures, especially when they're sitting, and we don't necessarily feel like identifying with the playable character. Well, that part is extremely paradoxical, but this small detail is almost touching in a way. Also, their small stature, compared to the ancestors, makes their silhouettes look almost childlike, especially when they are being studied by the second ancestor, or when they seem to shyly approach the saddened white robe. Very often the character has their head back, surrounded by infinite places and immense figures. With their masked face and, most of all, the desire not to overly assert the playable character and allow their emotions to be actually those of the player during the adventure, the emotions actually felt by the playable character are few, leaving room for those of the player. Like a character who is completely shaped with a past, a life, a quest, who therefore reacts to the setbacks they suffer as well as their victories, the mystery that the playable character represents, the mystery that also represents, for them as for us, the world they discover, will bring to the forefront the emotions we feel. For example, there is no reaction from the character when a guardian activates in the tunnels. It is the player who is afraid. If there is a visible emotion, it is that of the white robes, their pain most often, pain to which the playable character responds with a certain yet discreet empathy. It is therefore a little more complex than a character without emotions. They would perhaps embody a form of innocence in their relationship to the world, their relationship to the ancestors, who by their position would be more easily associated with reason, thanks to this imposing bearing, conferring on them an undeniable aura, this strange means of accessing them, which is fairly akin to prayer, at least a form of thought, by their omniscience finally, which confronts us with a choice on which no judgment seems to be made. Just like this life that unfolds in front of our eyes, a bond quickly forms between the ancestors and the playable character, a form of communion. Once again, it's not that simple. They live, or at least have lived. They are also beings of emotion. If, as I said earlier, these emotions are very little transmitted by the animation or the sound design, the character is completely mute apart from their chirping, the music, on the contrary, shows a lot of intensity and has this role, notably through the cello, the voice of the traveler, of powerful illustration of emotions. During its apparently quietest moments, the layers are deep, sometimes blurred by breath effects in the confluences, and from which rise solo interventions, more or less distant but all very hypnotic by their sound beauty, their depth. It's rather the bass flute which is used in these moments. The sound seems to emerge from these layers, often even the soloists are part of it. The bass flute sometimes plays distant scales, very reverberated, in sections played ad libitum, as the instrumentalist wishes. This intensity will run through all the music, all the moments of the game, just like this newly created character for whom everything is new, what they see, what they learn, what they feel. They, who were alone, now connect with the cloth fauna. They were born a few moments ago and already they learn that they will die. Journey is a game in which death is impossible, not until the storm, but it is not without fear. The encounter with the Guardians is very disturbing, challenging the tranquility despite the mystery of the adventure so far, the joy or euphoria of the previous sequence, the sunken city, or even the onirism of the discovery of seaweed and jellyfish in the previous room. If the character keeps an impassive look, the cello betrays their anguish by a stuttering effect. Later, under the storm, the orchestra will resume the accumulation effects, similar to what we heard at the beginning of the adventure. As I suggested in the first piece, this accumulation can illustrate the birth of the character. In Nadir, it is undoubtedly an illustration of the storm, from which, however, emerges the leitmotif in the original key, B minor, while Nadir is rather in E minor. The complaints, extremely rare, of the playable character or the player incessantly pushed away by the wind. As for the pain expressed sometimes by the music, it is perhaps that of the white robes, that of the world, and if it can be associated with the playable character, this is because it can translate this empathy. They understand the suffering of others, but they do not suffer themselves. If there is a complaint, it is not theirs. They are afraid, in the tunnel, in the storm, yet are they suffering? That would be too quick. There can be no personal lament of an ephemeral character in a world they barely discover, while the white robes are full of regrets. Would they be eternal? One last element makes the character very alive, their scarf. Journey is now more than 10 years old and it's a 3D game that has aged well. The backgrounds and their textures may look simple, but the sand shines and fills the screen. The playable character, likewise, is very simple, as little stick legs, but that doesn't matter because their robe and their scarf are well animated. The scarf, in particular, twists in all directions, almost to the point of having knots. As the character is usually seen from the back, this is what we see most often, and it is anyway the main element of the gameplay, since it is what allows us to fly. The game takes time on the key elements, it's effective and makes the game very lively anyway. Journey has a very solemn character. The use of the tapestry is a reminder of a distant and important story, a story of birth and death, that of the world, that of the little character. As I said earlier, it is like a founding myth, a cosmogony. The cutscenes that teach us the history of the world are called history lessons. During these lessons, we do not speak directly to the ancestors, the only means of communication here being the chirp, to which we cannot respond in these moments. The ancestors make a single sound that reveals the images from the tapestries. Their size, immense compared to ours, accentuates their difference in status. They speak, we listen. They seem to know, we learn. The fact that we do not speak directly to the white robes makes these lessons very solemn. They are clearly depicted as superior beings. We dare not or cannot speak to them. Yet they open up to us and a bond is imperceptibly created. Each one of them has a different attitude and all of them are presented in a logical way, from curiosity to regret that is almost tinged with hope at the sight of the mountain. Each of these reactions is connected to the history lesson the tapestry revealed. The first one is barely visible there, a tall figure whose attitude is not even distinguishable. Is their head bent forward looking at us, or head backwards facing the mountain, whose summit they would be examining at length? Hard to say, but I think they're looking at us because they tend to tilt their head back while chirping. The tapestry shows us the creation of the world, this famous cosmogony. Everything starts from the mountain and the symbols, source of energy, a creative language that gives birth to everything in the world, plant, animal, human, and this strange fabric. The second one leans frankly towards us in a rather amusing rush of curiosity. They look at us for a long time from every angle. The history lesson is indeed about the creation of the bridge which allowed the two characters, the two clans, to join. Curiosity could be satisfied. If the third character does nothing in particular, the tapestry shows the expansion of the civilization of the white robes. The fourth character is very moving, unable to look us in the eyes, unable even to look at the mountain. This is the moment when we learn of the split between the white robes, following the disappearance of the cloth, and the recourse to guardians in order to track down the slightest piece of red fabric. We don't see a connection between the ancestors and the cloth creatures, unlike our experience during the journey. Whereas the ancestors saw them as tools, we see their human nature and communicate freely with them. It is the mountain that unites us to the fifth character. We can hardly be seen walking beside them. Are we now their equal? We too are born from the mountain, of its mysterious symbols. The last ancestor finally looks at us, but steps aside as we discover the long tapestry. It is the whole of a journey that is revealed, the past, the present, and especially this future, fatal, death at the foot of the mountain. We become aware of the entirety of our adventure, of this fast-track life. A few hours in a world that seems to be eternal. These last looks exchanged are full of meaning. Are you really sure? They seem to be asking us, yet they seem to understand our choice. All these ancestors too are obsessed by this mountain. It's also a moment where the reference to mountaineering is the most concrete. In such a journey, death is almost certain. After listening, the character acts and chooses. The game itself is very codified. We start a chapter, explore the area, then at the end we access the history lesson, after which a large door opens and the next chapter begins. This makes it very solemn. There are pauses, it's not entirely organic. You take your time. This will allow a strong contrast with other very important moments, fabulous moments of communion with nature. Codes are definitely present everywhere in the game, by the colors that translate our belonging to the world or a certain form of knowledge, or the embroidery as a reminder of the number of journeys undertaken. The scarf itself is part of the codes. It is the main element of the gameplay, the one that gives us freedom through flight, and often players like to underline the beauty of the scarf as it grows. You have found the symbols, you can fly longer, escape the guardians more easily. But this scarf is not always there, another code. It appears with the first symbol like a knowledge that is granted to us and that we develop during the game, but that we also lose. At the top of the mountain, the scarf disappears, it is taken away from us, or rather we no longer need it. These codes almost give a mythological aspect to the game insofar as our journey is similar to a test whose judgment would take place after death. The white robes meet and seem to decide our fate, a fate whose reality is however a source of questions. Do we really return to the first plane, that of the desert? Are we really alive? And then there are codes even in co-op. As I said, you can't choose your travel partner, which has an impact on the interaction, the communication, and during a first game you can't be paired with a white-robed player. Other codes have been developed between players, such as the Hot on the Snow as you approach the summit. This duality between the solemnity of the game, which nevertheless leads to a strong harmony with its universe, is also perceptible in the music. Let's have another look at Naissance. The elegance, the solemnity are heard thanks to several things. First, the instrumentation. Cello, bass flute, harp and then the orchestra, an orchestra limited to string instruments. The weight of the strings in the instrumentation is offset by the specific color of the bass flute. It is an instrument that's less even than the flute in the sense that the tone will be less regular from one note to the other. The embouchure technique is also different, much more relaxed than with the flute, which immediately gives a breathier, less brilliant tone. These two elements coupled, the embouchure technique and the uneven character of the instruments, give a very particular color to specific notes, the F sharp in particular, or the E, especially since these notes are long. One can thus appreciate their tone more easily. And it brings a second dimension to the phrasing, a phrasing of tones, which can be heard on several scales. The tone changes from one note to another, but also, especially later on the concert flute, the tone of a note is gradually modified to lead to the next. You can hear it a lot in threshold on the longer notes. This is something you become even more aware of when you are an instrumentalist yourself and when you feel, beyond what you hear, what you have to do to obtain this phrasing, this change of color on one note, the finger legato, this is the thing, to add the right accentuation. A bond is created not so much between the musician and the music as between the musician and the composer. Some beautiful music can be difficult to play. Here, if Journey's score is beautiful to listen to, it is also very pleasant to play. There is something very concrete in the sound of the two solo instruments, especially since there is a certain pleasure in listening to the details of the phrasing, the vibrato, the bow strokes, the slight glissando between the C sharp and the A on the cello. The communion, in fact, begins right here, in the pleasure one gets from hearing these details, in a melody that is nevertheless elegant but not rigid. It is deeply organic. The mix of string and wind instruments also recalls the duality of the movement, either connected to earth through sand or air through flight, which sometimes come together as we slide. The flute, having learned the theme, it can now play it with the cello. The tones blend perfectly, a first step in communion. It is no longer the bass flute, though. There is less inertia in the sound, much more flexible, which allows for a very important tone phrasing, a liveliness in all dimensions of the flute sound. But more than that, after hearing the theme very bare in the first two iterations, the sudden presence of the orchestra gives the impression that the music just takes off, and the counterpoint develops in the high register, while the two solo instruments play in unison, also with the same nuances, the same intention, almost the same phrasing, the same moment of tension on the C sharp. Suddenly, each one brings their word, their contribution, their counterpoint. The orchestra too has a very beautiful, endless phrasing. It also uses sometimes like glissandi between the B and the G, for example. Without going beyond a certain framework, everything is very balanced. It already enhances the more orchestral parts of the score and even has a form of sensuality in its combination of melodic lines. A quick evolution towards the high register announces the global evolution of the score, which will start in the low register with the layers of the chapter select, highlighted by the bass flute, to open up to the highest notes of the violin. The climax of Apotheosis culminates on high D. It's a bit like the very short tutorial. The first moments, where we climb the hill before sliding down the sandy slope, are a miniature version of the complete journey. The whole thing folds almost as quickly as it took off. The game is calling us. We can compare this opening with the introduction of Shadow of the Colossus. In this work, we can find aspects close to Journey, notably its cyclical structure. I will come back to this in a few moments. But the treatment, even if only from a musical point of view, is different. The elegance and the balance are there, but to the specific sensuality of Journey will answer the extreme classicism of the introduction of Kootani's score, by its slight fugato of melodic lines, hardly disturbed by a few grace notes, announcing, however, the profoundly tragic character of the story. The beginning of the prologue, the theme repeated by the choir, is thus much more static, whereas Nascence quickly shows an important movement in the leitmotif itself, and then in the way the orchestra suddenly takes over the counterpoint. But after the exposition of the leitmotif, then this birth, it is necessary to learn again, because Nascence is not in the work, in the game. The counterpoint will become more complex as the gameplay evolves, an evolution that will always be related to the cloth creatures. At the same time, the role of the soloists will evolve, their individuality will assert itself. Apart from the movements, there is only one mechanic, the chirp. It is immediately accessible, and the music from the very first zone, the one that leads us to the chapter select, will make it possible to emphasize this feature I mentioned earlier and which is now found in many games. The chirps always follow the harmony of the music. As the music is only made of distant layers, like didgeridoos, this only reinforces the liveliness of the chirp, especially when it is charged. The diegetic sound element provides a form of counterpoint, or at least contrast, with the non-diegetic music. In this one, for the moment, everything seems rather blurred, insofar as the solo interventions struggle to really emerge from the rest of the music. They are still mixed, especially since everything is very organic. One often hears breathing sounds, like in Second Confluence, for instance. Still, some interventions stand out. Acquiring the first glowing symbol is clearly underlined by a bass flute solo. But apart from that, it's time for discovery. The character discovers the world, they discover themselves. The individuality of this omnipresent figure is still shy. In the next area, the bridge or the barrens, we only release cloth pieces from the guardians. It is only in the desert that we can really interact with this fabric as the creatures appear. We free them from the war machines again, but there they are still alive and they guide us towards their fellow creatures. We can even fly with them. This is where the counterpoint starts to assert itself in a very dialogical way between the viola and the flutes. A varied dialogue in which the two admittedly different voices yet sound deeply together, sometimes in homorhythm and in parallel octaves, sometimes one after the other. The evolution is also heard on the scale of the piece. Of course, the OST is completely recreated from the different sections of the music of the game, especially Threshold, which even contains sections that cannot be heard as is in the game, either in the proposed instrumentation or the succession of sections. But this does not change the evolution of the different phrases played by the soloists, flute and viola mainly in this level. At first very rhythmic, playing on the beats of the bar, it is in 3/4, but the structure of the percussion extends over several bars, so this can sound confusing, and structured by the grace notes, they turn into resolutely solo phrases. Individuality finally asserts itself, but it is coupled with dialogue between the playable character and the creatures, and between the two players in co-op. There is thus a line that sounds perhaps clearer between the soloist and the accompaniment, the latter being particularly transparent, with notably the harp, as well as the vibraphone and the marimba. It's more structured in the OST than in the game soundtrack, since the latter depends on what we do, on the presence or not of another player, on the proximity or not of creatures, on the frequency of the chirping, but in all cases we find this alternation between solos and duets, just like the gameplay where the creatures, and or the second player, are not always with us, where we sometimes explore alone, but the creatures do not forget us. They follow us or precede us, show us the way to the other creatures. The work of the instrumentalists on the phrasing is remarkable. It is one of the pieces where the tone of the flute is particularly ductile, and in the duets one finds, as in essence, this union in the intention of both soloists. The phrasing can slightly differ, but the intention is always the same. I will come back later to the next level, the Sunken City, where the relationship with the creatures develops in a very particular, jubilant way, but where the gameplay related to them does not really change. You can already fly with them in the previous level. On the other hand, in the cave, we learn the last mechanic with the creatures and the cloth plants, jellyfish and seaweed. We can use them to climb higher and higher, which we will have to do regularly in the following chapters. We are in direct contact with the creatures, the music is very oniric. But it is also a level in which we learn the history of the creatures. They too have a story, which is certainly part of the ancestors' history, but the discovery of the Guardians puts the emphasis on the victims of this civilization, which are, paradoxically, perhaps the last living creatures. After this level, the relationship between the playable character and the creatures is established. It is always present without fundamentally evolving, it tacitly deepens. Now it's time for the playable character to start discovering themselves. This evolution of the counterpoint, as well as the assertion of the soloists, will logically lead to apotheosis, which I will analyze later, a virtuoso support of the communion between the traveler, the creatures and their universe, and an absolute illustration of the game's purpose. There is a very ambivalent relationship to individuality in Journey. We are different from the other characters we meet, whether they're creatures or humans. We are the only red figure on the tapestries. The question of individuality even arises for the white robes, that are differentiated by their reaction to our presence. Do we meet the same person or a different one each time? The fact that we find all 6 of them at the end suggests that we actually have met each one of these imposing characters, as the scene accentuates the hierarchy that's already visible between us and them, between the little being and the 6 judges like an Areopagus. This solitude reinforces our individuality. We are unique and seem to carry a mission, a destiny connected to the mountain from which we were born. However, each time we live this story, each time a new journey is started, a new character similar to us is born, so to speak. At the end of the first level, the chapter select, we see in the distance a silhouette just like us, a NPC named Nick by the community. We can reach them thanks to a glitch, otherwise it's just a furtive vision. But most of all, in co-op, all the other players we meet have the same appearance and the same mission, and if we meet different players during our playthrough, they will all have this appearance. Only the color of the dress and the embroidery can change, and of course the symbol that appears when you chirp. This deep sense of individuality that the game grants us through the story, and paradoxically through the relatively anonymous character, their face completely masked, is partly erased when we meet other characters like us. We are one among others. The isolation is also temporal. The world that is presented to us seems over. The buildings are partially destroyed. The first zone looks like a huge cemetery, which is quickly confirmed by one of the tapestries where we see the white dresses lined up underground. There is little certainty about the white robes we encounter since they are on another plane. Are they alive? Is their story told to us through the mind in a form of prayer? Is it a transmission beyond death? What about our existence at the end of the game? The places we travel through are empty or gone, engulfed by the sand, and apart from a few guardians still operating, most of these machines are mere carcasses. We're revolving in an after because the before, when the white robes inhabited the world, is shown on the tapestries. We witness it in the world and in the history lessons. This after, which is however the moment of our own story, it is not an after for the playable character nor for the player, seems completely out of time. There is nothing that symbolizes anything about our own past, since it seems that we are born at the same time as the player's experience, as if we were born from the star and the symbols. The story is ephemeral, it's as long as the game, so barely a few hours, and thus mixes the after, that of the white robes. The civilization of the white robes has fallen, they are now in the after of this moment, and the present time, that of the player character. After all, we are reliving what the cloth creatures went through because there are still some functional guardians, which can blur the linearity and announce something else. The omnipresence of sand, and especially sandfalls, illustrates the passing of time. There is indeed a linearity. Time has passed, is still passing, even if it seems to be suspended for the duration of the adventure. But is this linearity infinite? For this temporal isolation, bored of said linearity, is offset by the deeply cyclical character of the work. Like Shadow of the Colossus, Journey forms a cycle since the end credits bring us back to our starting point, but the treatment of this cycle is different in the two games. In Shadow of the Colossus, the cycle of the characters is broken. That of Wander, because he died, then was reborn but as an infant. That of Mono, because her soul was lost, then brought back. In Journey, the cycle is perfect. It is temporal by the visible passing of time, of the day, since the credits take place partially under the night to return to the day in the color palette from the beginning. It is spatial because we return to the starting point. The camera moves towards one of the countless tombstones at the foot of the mountain, but this is not on such a definitive symbol that it lingers. The star at the top of the mountain prevails, and we follow its return to the starting point. As if death was only apparent, the tomb seems to be just a lure. We evolved, we became that very star which seemed to have created us. This cycle is found in the music, since it ends as it began, but we also find this image in some elements of the world or the gameplay. In particular, the war machines, the guardians. In these mechanical monsters, they are actually whales, the largest cloth creatures. You can hear it in the sound design, mixing mechanical, technological elements, and others more organic, plaintive, in glissando. These animals, made from fabric, scan the world in search of fabric. Finally, in the gameplay, you can maintain your flight thanks to the wind sometimes, to creatures which sometimes even guide you, and to the presence of another character in co-op. The scarf is recharged when you are close to another person. This gives a whole new look to the gameplay. The utter isolation of a single-player experience is replaced by a touching proximity. Staying side by side allows you to keep your scarf always filled with symbols. Flying is easier. However, despite the cycle, the linearity is still there when the end credits break with the rest of the music. I will come back to this later, but it is a special moment when the tension releases and the player can comment in a way on the experience they just lived. But after all, from the moment the player is about to undertake a new journey, the cycle starts again. This strange isolation, in a world to which we undoubtedly belong, disappears several times in two sequences illustrating the communion of the traveler with the creatures and the world they explore. The first is the famous sand surfing sequence in the Sunken City, where, surrounded by the cloth creatures, we race through the ruins of the ancestor civilization. The screen is saturated with red sand. The playable character almost disappears in favor of the dazzling sun behind the mountain. The second is the final sequence, which can be freely interpreted, where we find all the cloth creatures and, thanks to the ancestors who supposedly brought us back to life, finally reach the top of the mountain. The music for these two sequences are the most structured, given that they are very fluid, very organic moments with no real need for exploration, waiting, or reflection. The construction of the music is different. These are not layers on which more solo gestures are added, depending on the context. In these moments, the solo are more fleshed out. Most of all, the care given to the articulation will emphasize the dynamism of the music, making it even more intense, and recall the individuality in the music, since each instrument has its own phrasing, its own way to articulate. For example, in Abzu, there is this moment where we are carried along by a strong current and we end up in an area where, in a way very similar to the Sunken City from Journey, we swim directly with fish, notably dolphins, like the title Delphinus Delphis. I really like the way the articulation changes when the string ostinato starts after the long descending opening phrase. The same element is stated with different articulations, as if to illustrate individuality, the way each person can make the motif their own, something that would be repeated in their own way. This also reinforces the extremely lively character of this passage. For the Sunken City, the game on articulation begins just before the actual sequence, when the strings, and especially the flute, provide a striking contrast to the music of the history lesson. In the confluences, the atmosphere is often hazy and the articulation is chosen accordingly. Suddenly, the strings and the flute interrupt this particular atmosphere with a very sharp, dry staccato, suddenly bringing us back to a certain joviality and announcing the euphoric and cheerful character of the sequence. This is even more demonstrative in the OST, since there is no interruption. In the game, the history lesson ends, then the creatures take us to the Sunken City. During the sequence itself, the great variety of articulation, whether on the cello or the flute, the beautiful work on the percussion, the changes of articulation when a motif is repeated will, as in Abzu, but perhaps even more intensely, accentuate the dynamism of this moment, refer to this paradoxical quest for individuality, add a new dimension to the counterpoint, and illustrate the variety of the gameplay. Contrary to what one might think in such a sequence, slightly guided because you can't really stop sliding, you can still do a lot of things. You can still jump or fly with the help of the cloth dolphins. Even more, this great versatility in articulation and sound will sometimes illustrate changing emotions in a world that is partially unknown to us, and in which our surprise and joy both seem to be constantly renewed. This communion culminates in the last sequence of the game, the summit or paradise. The traveler is somehow brought back to life and flies, still helped by the creatures and their now oversized scarf, to the summit where they have been somehow granted access. It is the most structured piece of all the OST, the most balanced in its counterpoint, the most orchestral too, contrasting with the rest of the music. The leitmotif is fully asserted on the viola, supported by a strong counterpoint on the violins, where the phrasing is brought not by the melodic line itself. This triplet accompaniment is rather rhythmic, but again by the variety of the articulation. The evolution of the counterpoint will also allow something particular in this piece related to its structure, a build-up as the climax approaches, and to which I am particularly sensitive. A crescendo of articulation, that is to say that the realization of the articulation gains in intensity as the climax approaches, to culminate on the short phrase ending on the high D. At the beginning of the piece, there is only the accompaniment, the triplets on the strings. The variety in the articulation, the presence of many slurred notes, counterbalances the staccato of the strings, the three sections playing together, and softens the motoric aspect of the string section. Then, when the leitmotif is given to the violas, it is played détaché but in a dilated way with very long notes, which dilutes a little the attacks. They are further apart. They are anyway quite soft. The addition of synthetic layers, rather blurred, and bell plates also drowns everything in a kind of sound halo. The repetition of the leitmotif with the cellos doubling the violas already gives a little more strength to the articulation, simply because there are more instruments, but the idea remains similar. It is in the following part that it changes. Already the transition motif, second violins and violas, presents a more intense articulation. It is a first step because we change zone, the jellyfish appear, and the flute is added. The crescendo and the need to give a direction to the phrase makes it necessary to change the articulation. It is all the more significant that from now on the accompaniment is almost exclusively playing détaché, while the cellos are now in tremolos and the double basses are more audible. It was necessary to bring this change. However, the following part does an about-face. In a moment of absolute plenitude, the leitmotif is stated again, on the first violins and the violas, 1 and 2 octaves higher, while the triplet accompaniment, on the second violins and the cellos, the latter barely audible, changes to a different articulation. The notes are slurred by 3, which makes it an extremely moving background. This crescendo of articulation is not finished. We are not yet at the climax. The second part of the leitmotif is underlined by a counterpoint in the violas in quarter notes. We regain in intensity. The change of register, we are in the high register for everyone, the viola's part is even written in treble clef, and the cellos play on the whole range of the instrument. The presence of the whole orchestra in a fascinating counterpoint accentuates the necessary evolution of the articulation before the climax. The cellos return to a very Norris staccato to support the strings, especially the violins, whose almost piercing attacks accompany the last effort of the traveler's silhouette, now flying without limit, we are bathed in that goo made of cymbals, to the summit. The ultimate communion of the character with the mountain and all the cloth creatures, the culmination of the transmission of the main theme to the entire orchestra and the softness of the attacks are followed by the last impulse of a hero, with or without a companion, illustrated by the last effort of an orchestra, where each instrument asserts itself until the last note. After the climax, the music unwinds extremely quickly. Everything relaxes in a few moments. A short transition leads us to the last cello solo. The scarf disappears, this summit, this bridge we dreamed about so much, we stared at so much is within our reach, alone or with a companion. It is no longer the opening solo from the OST, the beginning of Nascence, which we did not hear in the game and sounded like a speech, a statement of this theme, certainly carried by the voice of the traveler, but especially for me the theme of transmission. The change of register, the solo begins an octave higher than when it was played first in Nascence. The repetition again 1 octave higher, the extreme tension linked to the dilation of the tempo, it's very slow and free, and the intensity of the sound, by the range certainly, but especially the management of the vibrato, perfect, make it an absolute affirmation of the individuality of this character, who manages until the end to blend mystery and proximity, are they actually someone other than ourselves, isolation and friendship, individuality and universality. The interpretation of this sequence is specific to each person. In my case, the presence of these gates evoking Tori, at least for me, and the fact that the character crosses them only one way, will make me believe that they have left the material world. I do not see why the ancestors would be able to bring the traveler back to life, but again the interpretation of this last moment is extremely personal. As often in video games, the sound design brings something else, emphasizing even more this communion with the creatures, whose sound design is reminiscent of children laughing, the whales and their famous and amusing sound effects, and the soft and discreet sound of the elegant hero's footsteps on the snow. Journey has an ambivalent relationship to language. There is a language in the universe, an essentially written language made of symbols. There are several types of symbols gathered in different alphabets detailed on the wiki. There are, for example, the 21 symbols associated to the players and the collectibles, others specific to the textures or the particles. The fog is filled with symbols, we can see it when the focus is on them, to the cloth creatures, as well as another more complex alphabet visible on one of the tapestries. The sound is emitted as we chirp, but otherwise the language is completely written. This would not be surprising if this language, these symbols rather, did not seem to be little more than a language, a source of energy, better, a creative energy. As early as the introductory cutscene, they appear associated with the star and thus with the creation of the playable character, who seems to be born from the impact of these symbols on the ground. This is confirmed in the first history lesson, where we witness the creation of all the species in the world through these signs, or at least an energy associated with these signs. A symbol appears and turns into a luminous point, like a form of soul. In the case of the cloth, it is different. It seems to have something more. We see several signs appearing, and the luminous point, the soul supposedly, is bigger. Later, we too are presented as a creation of the mountain. We do not see the symbols, but our play is special. We follow the decline of the civilization of the ancestors. The fabric and the symbols on it are associated with energy, since they power the structures of the ancestor civilization. In the game, by chopping, thus releasing a symbol, it appears on the screen, we give energy to the long strips of cloth, healing them in some way, before they disappear and release all the cloth pieces trapped in the carcasses of the guardians. The symbols finally seem to act as a barrier, a force field that prevents the guardians from reaching us, and accompany the last history lesson, the one where the entirety of our journey, even its outcome, is revealed. The metaphor of the written symbol as a source of energy is multiple. It should be noted, however, that the ancestors encountered during the adventure do not have symbols on them or when they chop. They don't have a scarf either, but they can make the traveler's scarf grow before they propel themselves to the top. One could imagine, but I am not one to speculate, that this is in fact the role of the 6 ancestors, bringing the traveler to the other side, to the summit, as a form of penance which could have been chosen voluntarily or imposed by the mountain after having destroyed civilization. This could explain their presence after our death. We can see in that moment a form of judgment, but maybe it is rather a crossing. What would they indeed have to judge about such a short existence, and knowing their direct responsibility in the decline of the civilization and the disappearance of the cloth creatures? Do they make sure that the cycle continues, that the traveler reaches the top and becomes a star or a symbol again? They would have the ability to manipulate the fabric or the symbols, but not for themselves. But can this traveler become a symbol again if they are already dead? This language is omnipresent, near the statues leading to the history lessons, on the tombstones next to the tapestries, in the fog, on our scarf, or in the world, floating, small collectible useful to our movement. It is rich, made of multiple alphabets, the symbols are numerous. As far as we are concerned, we can only emit one. One symbol among the 21 possible is assigned to us. It appears on the screen each time we chop. It will not translate anything except our identity. At the end of the game, the names of the companions we met appear as well as their own symbol. We can then recognize them. The symbol we are given may, however, appear different on the screen of the other players. We therefore assume that the symbol, or some of the symbols, could be first names. We don't choose this symbol, we don't even choose the corresponding note, since it is determined by the harmony. Only the rhythm can be chosen. In co-op, where communication becomes most necessary, it is surprisingly made almost impossible, at least initially difficult, by restricting it to the diegetic language element. What is specific to the universe isolates us from it. We can't decipher anything written, nor can we pick out any symbol. This isn't a matter of deciphering a language anyway, as in Chants of Sennaar, for example. One cannot so much use language as chant it. The isolation felt in this world can be related to this denied language that we do not understand at first, then cannot really use. This language is purely written, no words are actually spoken. The cloth creatures have sound reactions, the chirps are sometimes almost vocal, but no words, no phonemes, no unwritten languages are heard. The voice only appears at the end of the adventure in the game's credits, when Elizabeth Scott sings a text in several languages, actual languages. This acts as a way back to reality, a return to our world as the game is immersive. The names of the fellow travelers, the companions, finally appear, another break, another return to reality. the player can finally take some distance while leaving room for their feedback on the experience, their opinion, their emotion, bringing them back to the beginning of the game. The player has also experienced something, they made the most of the journey, they have learned. Once again, linearity is superimposed on the cycle. The music evolves, but gentle break brings us back to the very beginning. If there seems to be little to do in Journey, there is much to feel and much to say. It is a work that transcends its simplicity through the intensity of its experience, both as a sensory experience, it is beautiful to see, to listen to, and as a game experience, whether one is alone or enjoying companions during the journey, side by side to the end, or returning to the state of dust upon disconnection. The obviousness of the metaphor can nevertheless be interpreted differently according to one's beliefs. Is it a question of death, of an initiation rite, of reincarnation? But there is much more than this metaphor. I did not mention it that much in this video. Such a status cannot be reached, I think, by chance and more personally, when one can detach oneself from a work of art and make something out of it that will last beyond the sensory experience, when the artistic intentions are of such a richness and such a clarity that one can make something out of them in addition to the work itself, I cannot see anything more beautiful. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a long one. Again, it would appear I have no ability for concision. It would also appear that my most popular video, at least for now, is my first story video when my English accent was questionable at best. It still is, but I was so slow. Anyway, it might be time for my analysis of Ori's soundtrack, but I'm also supposed to make a short video on Zelda's musical elements in Breath of the Wild. Well, I don't really know myself. In any case, I'll be back to Ori very soon. After that, it should be Shadow of the Colossus. Okay, thanks again, and goodbye!